on today's StoryBeat.
I'm attracted to stories about problems created by adults that children have to deal with. Problems not of their own making. Children, they didn't create war. You don't go into foster care because of something you did. It's because of something your parents did. But you have to cope with these circumstances. And so I'm interested in resilience.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Mark Jonathan Harris, is a 3-time Oscar-winning and Emmy-nominated filmmaker, as well as an award-winning author of 10 books, a distinguished professor of film of 4 decades, and an acclaimed journalist. His newest book, Misfits, is a collection of wonderfully character-driven short stories. I've read Misfits and can tell you the book comprises 12 dynamic stories about offbeat characters grappling with personal encounters as they try to live their disconnected lives. I highly recommend this insightful set of stories to you. Mark started his professional career covering crime for the famed City News Bureau of Chicago. He also reported national news for the Associated Press before making TV documentaries. For several years, Mark was a contributing editor to New West magazine. He also wrote articles, essays, and reviews for national newspapers and magazines, including TV Guide, American Heritage, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Washington Post. He's also published 5 award-winning novels for children. Mark's early films document some of the most important political issues of the 1960s. Huelga is a portrait of Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers Union and the first year of the union's historic Delano grape strike. The Redwoods, which won an Academy Award for Best Short Documentary, presents the Sierra Club's successful case for establishing a Redwoods National Park. And The Foreigners explores the work of a group of Peace Corps volunteers confronting the contradictions of U.S. foreign policy as they try to bring social change in Colombia. 2 films Mark wrote and directed that explore the Holocaust won Oscars for Best Feature Documentary. The Long Way Home documents what happened to the survivors of the concentration camps immediately following their liberation. And Into the Arms of Strangers, Stories of the Kindertransport chronicles Britain's rescue mission of 10,000 children shortly before World War II. The U.S. Library of Congress selected Into the Arms of Strangers for permanent preservation in the National Film Registry. Among Mark's other notable nominated and award-winning films are Unchained Memories, Readings from the Slave Narratives, Darfur Now, Breaking Point, The War for Democracy in Ukraine, and Foster. He was also a consulting producer for the 5-part Peabody award-winning series Asian Americans. For 40 years, Mark taught filmmaking at the School of Cinematic Arts at the University of Southern California. He also taught for 7 years at the School of Film and Video at Cal Arts. And in 2010, the International Documentary Association honored him with its Scholarship and Preservation Award for his educational work. So for all those reasons and many more, it's a great privilege for me to have Mark Jonathan Harris as my guest on StoryBeat today. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's a great pleasure to have you here. So let's go back in time just a little bit. Where were your earliest inspirations and influences? What brought you to writing and being a journalist in the first place?
Well, I think if I look back on why I became a writer, is that from an early age I told stories. I had a very difficult mother. And it was very difficult to contradict her.
Okay.
So early on, I developed an alter ego, an imaginary brother, Morris. I don't remember this, but my mother tells the story that she was getting me dressed to go someplace where I'm sure I didn't want to go. And in the middle, I turned to my imaginary brother and I said, "You shouldn't say that." And then my mother said, what did Morris say? And I said, he said, "You stink." So I couldn't really speak directly to my mother. I needed an alter ego, another character to express my feelings to my mother. So maybe that was early on.
You had an imagination early on that led you to other characters.
It did. So I think I found that it was finding my own voice. And it actually, in terms of making documentary films and being a journalist, you often look for other people to say the things that you believe.
Mm-hmm.
You look for characters who are like you, who are willing to speak truth that you might not want to say yourself.
And so when did you start to write? Was it as a young boy?
I wrote in college, but I also, at the same time, I fell in love with the movies in the 60s. The 60s were a time of, that was the introduction of foreign films to America. There was the French New Wave, Truffaut, Godard. There's Ingmar Bergman in Sweden, Antonioni Fellini in Italy. And I just fell in love with that cinema. And that was a new language for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I really didn't know at that time how to get into the film business.
So few do.
And at that time, film school was not the gateway to the industry that it later became. It was only in the 60s when George Lucas was at USC, Coppola was at UCLA, and Marty Scorsese was at NYU, that film school really became one way to enter the business. In fact, when I graduated from college, I was interested in becoming a filmmaker. And there was an advisory group of people, alumni, who listed themselves as possible mentors. So I went to New York, and the Rochemont brothers did the March of Times. And it was Dennis de Rochemont. And he was sitting behind this large desk. And I said, I want to become a movie maker. And he said, is your father very rich? I said, no. He said, have you written a best-selling novel yet? I said, no, not yet. He said, those are the only two ways I know to get in the business. Your father's rich enough to finance your film, or Hollywood buys your book and you go along with it to Hollywood.
And how old were you at this time?
I was 21, and I thought that, well, I needed to find another way.
And so then what drew you to becoming a journalist, which is what you did first?
Well, that was another possibility. And also, I was looking for life experience. I was sick of academia. I never expected years later to end up in academia.
That's ironic.
Yes, it is. I have a funny story about that. And journalism was a way to get more experience. And I moved to Chicago to work for the famed City News Bureau. And they give you very little training. They throw you out in the street. My first day as a reporter, I went to the Maxwell Street police station, parked outside, went in and said to the desk sergeant, anything going on? He said, no, it's a slow day, kid. I walked outside and my car had been stolen. That was my first actually published story in the Chicago Tribune, about like 2 paragraphs. Reporters,
welcome to the news.
Yeah. Yes, the news happens to you as well as other people.
So how close would you say journalism is to making documentaries? It's actually kind of akin, isn't it?
Very, very much so. You're trying to find the story. And journalism has certainly affected my writing style, because you learn as a journalist to find the salient detail,
Mm-hmm.
to write compactly, concisely, to find the details that make stories come alive. So I think my journalism training certainly spilled over into my writing.
And then you eventually, we'll talk much more about this in a bit, but you eventually go off to write, for instance, Misfits, which is somewhat fictional, if not totally fictional, but it feels kind of journalistic. It feels like that. So that has to be a part of how you developed your fictional side as well.
I think definitely. Documentaries and journalism, I mean, are very similar. One, you're writing words, and the other, you're writing with images.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to find the images to tell your story. So I was very fortunate to have opportunity to get a job at a television station. And I started actually, in the news side, doing short 5-minute pieces. And then I got the opportunity to do longer pieces.
So the short pieces that you started doing, were those written or found? Did you go out
But
and
they're found. You find a story. They're human interest stories. That's what
Mhm.
I was interested in. But I was making films in the '60s, which is time of tremendous turmoil here in this country, civil rights struggle, Vietnam War, and that's really how I came to do the first significant film I made, which was about Cesar Chavez and the grape strike. That was the civil rights struggle of the West Coast,
Mhm.
farm workers trying to form a union.
So you clearly, it's quite obvious, there's a theme throughout your entire career where you deal with, as you say, human interest or socially conscious or socially relevant stories. Where did that passion come from? Where did that start? From being a journalist or prior to that?
I think prior to it, I think I'm a child of the '60s. My politics were formed certainly in the '60s. At that time, we thought we could bring about a revolution in this country naively.
I'm not so sure you didn't.
Well, we made some significant changes, not the revolution that we.
And by the way, when I say you, I mean me too. I'm of
Yeah,
that age as well.
yeah. So, well, you look at our politics today, you wonder.
You definitely have to wonder if you look at today's politics, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
So, okay, so what kind of stories, when you're looking for stories to do, because they're obviously in your world, they're everywhere. You can look out the window and find all kinds of stories. But what types of stories do you purposefully avoid?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the key to being a successful filmmaker is to find stories in which you find a personal connection. The hardest films that I've ever made are ones that I've done, frankly, to pay the rent,
Hmm.
and where I really couldn't find a way in, a personal way in. They were work for hire, where there was nothing at stake for me emotionally. Those are the hardest films. So I try to avoid them. I try to avoid films. Fortunately, as my career developed, I was able to have more choice in my
Hmm.
projects. So that's one thing. And I'm always looking for characters. I think casting in documentary films is essential.
Casting.
Casting, yes. It's as essential in documentary films as it is in fiction. You have to find characters that the audience wants to root for or can identify with or wants to follow.
I find what you just said a moment ago about you have to find your way in for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that you have in your documentary work, which I assume is true in journalism as well, some kind of a personal slant to it. It doesn't have to be a completely biased slant, but there's something that attracts you to a story. So that's got to come out in the creation of it.
Absolutely. I've made films long enough now and written children's books to look at the subjects that I'm attracted to. And certainly my children's books, and to some extent in my films too, I'm attracted to stories about problems created by adults that children have to deal with.
Mm,
Problems not of their own making. Into the Arms of Strangers, foster children. They didn't create war. You don't go into foster care because of something you did.
right.
It's because of something your parents did, because
Hmm.
of their neglect or abuse. But you have to cope with these circumstances. And so that's been one theme of the work that I've done. I'm interested in resilience. So The Long Way Home is a film about the Holocaust, but it's really not about why did the Holocaust happen. It's how do you survive a catastrophe like that? How do you rebuild your lives? And that's similar in a way to foster care. You're thrown into foster care. How do you cope with that? How do you come out of that with some sense of personal integrity, hope?
And with your feet on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are the kind of stories that I'm attracted to.
So let's talk for a moment about Misfits because I think what you're saying ties in very nicely here. I think the 12 stories in Misfits have sensibility toward that in them. They're not necessarily about those exact things that we just mentioned about children and how do they deal with their situations, but there's a little bit of that in there and the themes seem to come through. So tell the listeners more about Misfits. Tell us about what it's actually about. What is the purpose of you having written these 12 stories?
Well, some of the stories actually emerged from my work as a filmmaker, my films. I did foster. There's a story in the book about a lawyer who, in her relationship with a foster kid,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a leftover question for me from the film, and it was really a question to myself: how far would I go to change someone's life?
Mm-hmm.
Another story, Mute, is about a father who's trying to cope with the fact that his son is not the son that he imagined, that his son is autistic on the spectrum.
That's called Mute, correct?
Yes, Mute. Other stories are the stories are all about kind of fraught encounters between unlikely people, people of different generations, people of different ethnicities. They're all stories about people who are somewhat disconnected, alienated, trying to find connection in the world. And also, they are, in some ways, finding unexpected answers to their problems in different
Mm-hmm.
places. And so that's connected to what I was talking about before, resilience.
Right.
And the stories revolve around issues of climate change, inequality, racism, all the problems that we're facing today. And those are some of the same problems that I deal with in my documentaries.
And that's why it comes out as journalistic in a way, because it feels so much in touch with what's going on right now.
Right. The stories are very contemporary, and there are issues that are bothering me or haunting me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to get at them through fiction. A lot of these stories were written during the pandemic when it was very difficult to make films. You had to make, yeah, because especially documentaries, everybody is masked. There were so many obstacles to making a decent documentary under COVID that I said, okay, I'm going to write stories now. I've always written, but this was a good time. I can't make films, so let me write these stories. But these are the same kind of issues that I would deal with in film.
Mm-hmm, for sure. So, are any of the stories actually based on real stories or real people? I know you've got my favorite story in the book is the one with Oppenheimer in it. So you have a real character, Oppenheimer, but
Yes,
J. Robert Oppenheimer. But
yeah,
were any of the other stories, are they actually about real people that you knew?
not directly.
All fiction then.
It's all fiction. And I certainly didn't know Oppenheimer, but I imagined this conversation running into Oppenheimer in the bar. And these were questions that I would like to ask Oppenheimer.
Mm-hmm.
And so Oppenheimer was long dead by the time I got to have this conversation with him.
For sure.
Yeah, and it brings up the same kind of moral concerns and issues. And it's trying to relate the personal to the political. And a lot of my films are dealing with political issues through personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, another film, a good example of this is Breaking Point, the War for Democracy in Ukraine, which I co-directed with Ola Sanyan, who is a very well-known Ukrainian director. And we were looking to try to see how the events in Ukraine affected ordinary people. And we were looking not for politicians, although there are a few in the film, people who then became involved in politics, but we were looking for people who life was transformed by the events of the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity, and then either it went into the army, went into politics, trying to change their society. So we had a clear idea of the kind of people we wanted to find. And what I said earlier, often you look for people to say the things that you want to say. And casting is really very important. You look through a lot of people to find the real ones.
So casting, as you say, is so important to what you do. But when you're making a documentary, much like when you're writing something new, fictional, you don't really know how it's going to exactly turn out. You may
No,
have an idea, and so you're finding it. Could you tell as you were writing the 12 stories in Misfits, can you tell as you're making a documentary, as you're going, that this is going to work out well, or is it always a mystery till you get to the end?
well, you want to surprise yourself. If you surprise yourself, then there's a good chance you surprise the audience or
Absolutely.
your viewer. I write very much to discover. So I didn't know that I didn't set out to write a book. I started writing stories, and then suddenly one day I realized, wait a minute, I have a dozen stories here that can make up a book, and the stories seem to comment on each other in some way.
So you had no intention of writing the book as a compilation of stories at all.
No, maybe at a certain point when I had about 9 or 10 stories, I thought, maybe I have a book here. And then the question is how to put the book in order. And yeah, so no, I didn't start out with that idea in mind.
You have to program the book like you would edit a movie. It's got to be in the right order.
Exactly. Yeah. And so my editor and I worked a lot on that and figured out the right order. But the exciting thing about documentaries is that you don't know what you're going to find. And that's why I'm addicted to the documentary experience. You put a camera on your shoulder and it provides you access to people and worlds that otherwise you would be impossible to enter or very difficult.
When you start to make a documentary, are you trying to contrive it in some way to start? Are you trying to get to a point and that's what you're driving towards?
Well, you have an idea of a kind of a structure. I generally work out a kind of treatment, which is a fall back. Is that, okay, if all these things happen, I have a film. But David Bezos, is a famous quotation, is if the documentary you end up making is the one you started out to make, you haven't been listening.
That's true.
So it is a journey of exploration. You have an idea, but you don't know what people are going to say to you. You don't know what kind of actions you're going to find.
Much like you don't know what the characters are going to say to you when you're writing your fiction.
Exactly. I don't know. And some days you sit down and it's like, well, what's going to happen today? And sometimes nothing happens. That's discouraging.
Does it feel like fishing to you?
A little bit. I'm not a great fisherman, but yeah, it does. You cast your line and what is it people are going to say? What are they going to do next? And often they do surprise you. I'm surprised.
So then what are the biggest challenges you think that you typically go through both in writing stories and in making movies? What are the big challenges?
The big challenge, I think, is identifying what the story is really all about. So I do a lot of revision. I edit my films a long time. I do a lot of revision in my stories. You know, it's like, okay, what is this? It's a constant effort to refine and clarify.
My training was that which ran counter to everything you're taught in English classes. My training was, and I teach the same, which is don't try to figure out your theme and your premise until after you've written at least one draft.
Exactly.
And then look at what you've written, and then you can figure out what the theme and premise are, and then you make sure that's infused through the whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and when you get to the end of the first draft, and read it, it's, oh, this is what it's about. And then you cut away what doesn't contribute to that and try to make sure that it all fits together in the end.
So how do you think that storytelling, because you've been a storyteller your whole life, how do you think that storytelling helps readers and audience members make sense of the world?
Well, I think that's why basically we tell stories, is to try to make sense of the world. One of the children's books that I did, Come the Morning, is about a homeless family. I wanted to do something about homelessness. You went to school at USC, you know the neighborhood.
I do.
Driving in South Central LA, increasingly I saw homeless families, you know, mothers and their children with shopping carts. And, you know, it was impossible to ignore. So I wanted to learn more about that. And I thought maybe I'm going to make a film about that. Then when I started to research this, I realized that the idea of being in a film and identifying yourself as homeless was very stigmatizing for a lot of people. They didn't want to do that. So I thought, okay, well, better to write a book about it. So I actually, as a journalist, I started out, I thought, okay, I'm going to just go downtown and hang around and find out what's going on, what people had to say. So I dressed in my worst clothes, my garden clothes, holes in my jean, was hanging around this street corner where there were other homeless people. And within 5 minutes, somebody came up to me and hit me up for money. And I said to him, how do you know I have money? He said, well, look, your beard is trimmed. He said, your glasses look expensive. And he says, you don't smell like you've been living on the streets. So I thought, okay, this is not the best way to research this. And so I changed my strategy, and I went to, there was a Salvation Army shelter for families. And I went there twice a week in the evening at dinner, and I said I was interested in talking to people about their experience if they were interested. And this is what the whole idea of story, people wanted to talk because they were trying to figure out how their life had ended up this way. Talking to a sympathetic stranger or somebody who was just willing to listen, help them to try to make sense of their own experience and to find some way to put their lives in perspective.
And you're having a huge problem with that in Los Angeles now, am I correct? The homelessness problem is gigantic.
It's huge. It's gotten worse and worse, yes.
Do you think that when you hit the streets like that, you're acting like a journalist again?
Well, I was thinking participant, but no. I mean, I think it was much better for me to say, not to disguise myself and just say I'm a journalist. And, people tell their stories. I've had this experience. It can be therapeutic to tell your story to other people.
Oh, sure. Well, that's what therapy is, isn't it?
Yeah, and then it helps you to reframe your narrative.
Your personal narrative.
Yeah. And also it's like, a lot of the stories in Misfits are about people feel alone, isolated. And it's trying to stories help you see that you're not alone, completely isolated. There are other people like you. That other people are experiencing the similar kinds of problems.
Am I correct? All 12 stories are centered in Los Angeles. Is that correct?
Yeah, most I think, except for a couple.
Except for A Drink with Oppie, which takes place, in Santa Fe?
Yeah, and then there's another one that takes place at a summer camp that's not in Los Angeles.
So why LA? Because you live there, or was there something about LA that was important?
A couple of things. I've lived in LA for the last 50 years.
Right.
So LA is my home. I know it. But also I see Los Angeles as a kind of Ellis Island of the 21st century, where you have every possible subculture and immigrant group, from Samoans to Chinese to Mexican Americans to Central Americans. In my characters in my book, somebody's from El Salvador, or somebody's from, they're from all different countries and different generations. And this is LA. I was in the airport the other day. I was flying something, and I thought, wow, look at the massive people and the diversity of people. The Republicans should just come to the airport in LA and see that the world that they're talking about doesn't quite exist anymore. It's certainly not in places like Los Angeles or New York.
No, it's the great melting pot.
Yeah, it really is. And, I also teach at USC. My students from Nigeria, they're from China, they're from Europe, they're from all around the world. It's a very multicultural, multi-ethnic place.
Are you hoping in your work that it will be to convince people to come to your point of view?
No, I don't know. I'm not writing to, I think, convert anyone. I'm writing really for discovery, and I'm writing it. You mentioned before, it's like reporting, to report. This is the world. You want a glimpse of the world as it is? I'm trying to report and write about the world as I see it. And that's similar to documentary films. And I ran the documentary program at USC for a long time. And that's part of where I learned more about LA, because my students were making films about the Korean community, During the riots, they made a film. We had a group of people. Some made films from the Korean perspective. Some made films from the black perspective. Some made films from the white perspective. Then we put them all together. It was like trying to start a conversation. And when I started out in the '60s, I was much more political in the sense I want to make a film that's going to bring about political change. Now I realize that was somewhat unrealistic. I mean, films can bring about a change, but you look at, Al Gore did Inconvenient Truth, and we still have a world of climate deniers.
But it's interesting, if you go back and watch that movie now, he's prescient in many ways.
He is prescient, but a lot of people, of course,
still don't pay attention.
Still didn't pay attention. So it's hard to believe that a film alone is going to change the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this. You shouldn't try. But my expectations for social or personal change have been lowered, greatly lowered.
Through the reality of what my friend Ron Sargent once called the sledgehammer of the marketplace.
Yes, that's part of it. And just reality is it's really hard to change people's mind. But you also don't know the effect that you can have. One story, when I was making Into the Arms of Strangers,
mm-hmm.
one of the women that we interviewed had not told her story very much to anyone. She had not told her story to her children because she wanted to, I guess, she didn't want to inflict that pain upon them. But at the time when we found her, she was willing to tell her story. It was later in her life. Her kids were grown up. She told her story. And she had a horrendous childhood in Germany. Her first story that she tells is that she gave a birthday party at 11, and she was Jewish, and nobody came to the birthday party. Then her father was killed on Kristallnacht. She was put in an orphanage. She was sent to England, never saw her mother again.
Mm.
Anyway, she told the story and with far more emotion than she expected. And months later, when the film was finished, I met with her again, and she said, before I told my story to you, I used to have nightmares. She said, after I told my story, she said, I stopped having nightmares.
Wow, because she's been building that up in her mind for so long.
And just to be able to tell that story, and all that she had repressed for so long, that pain, it helped her, it freed her from nightmares. So you don't know what effect your films are going to have either on the subjects that are in them or on people who view them.
Absolutely. You really don't know, and you don't control that in any way, shape, or form other than to put out the work. And that's what you do. Speaking of your two Oscar-winning Holocaust movies, documentaries, I'm wondering, do they relate in any way to A Drink with Oppie? Because after all, he created the bomb that ended the war that freed them out of the concentration camps.
Yeah, I think they're related in some ways, but not directly.
Well, definitely not directly.
But yeah, I think it's that same sensibility. It deals with the same kind of moral questions: is how can we inflict such pain on so many people? I mean, it's about genocide in a way. Genocide certainly in the Holocaust, but here, I mean, how can we kill so many innocent people? I mean, you talk about, can your films make a difference? After making films about the Holocaust, one thing that I came away from that feeling is that this should never happen again. Yet, that's why I got involved in making the Darfur movie about Darfur, because again, we're seeing this inhumanity repeated. And look today, look at what's happening in Israel and Palestine.
And in Africa and elsewhere.
In Africa, yeah. I mean, these ancient hostilities and grudges. It makes you wonder how much we have evolved as human beings. You know, we have IA, we have the internet, we have all these, and we've developed nuclear power, all this, but our human psyche hasn't kept up with the advances in technology and science.
This is very ancient stuff that goes back to the beginning of humanity.
Yeah, yep,
We've never gotten off of it,
right.
which is sad. And so that's probably what's driving you to continue to tell these stories, I assume.
It's certainly part of it, and it's also trying to understand.
Because you're not writing science fiction, you're not writing
No,
fantasy stories, it's not sword and sorcery. You're writing about real people and their real problems.
even my children's novels were about children coping with divorce, children coping with homelessness, with dislocation. So, I mean, they were coping with the real problems that we're all dealing with.
So let's talk about your writing process, because that's what this
Okay.
show's all about, is how do you do this? When you've got a story that you say, okay, this is what I want to focus on and I want to write this, I want to make a documentary of it. In either case, you're still coming at it as a storyteller. Where do you begin? Do you begin by sitting down and looking at the various elements that you're going to put in it? Do you start to outline it? How do you start?
I generally start with characters.
Characters.
I think much of my work is character driven. When I talked before in documentaries too, finding the characters. It's like the question you ask, from whose point of view are we telling this story? And this is true in film. So from whose point of view are we seeing it, and what are we seeing? In films, it's very much what are we seeing?
But you still have to have it come through a character's point of view, don't you?
Right. Yes, it's definitely. So it's like in fiction, you can get much more inside a character's head, its consciousness,
Oh, for
than you
sure.
can in film. We only know what a character feels through what he does, his
Right.
actions, and what he says. But you can get into a person's consciousness more easily in fiction. But I start with a character, and then what's the conflict? There's a story in the book of Misfits about it's the main character is a Salvadoran illegal immigrant who's taking care of a bitter old lady who wants to die, and she realizes that the woman wants to die, the Amelia, the Salvadoran caretaker, and the woman she's taking care of wants to starve herself to death. And Amelia, who has experienced starvation and knows that that's a sin in her worldview, is trying to prevent that. And it's a story that's the clash. So that in a way that developed for my mother, who had lived to be 100 and was in her last year was wanted to die. Really, she was tired of living, and she didn't have a Salvadoran caretaker, but the woman who was taking care of her was very Catholic and would not continent. My mother is trying to starve herself to death.
No.
That's a sin. Only God knows when the time for you to die.
I mean, that's fascinating stuff. When you have characters, you've decided I'm going to focus on this character or that character. How do you then make that character three-dimensional? What do you go through?
Sometimes I write monologues. I often sit down just free associated. How does Amelia think about the world? And I just, it's like, what does Amelia think about this or that? Just character sketches, just for myself. What kind of TV does she watch? When did she come here? And you're just creating a character from whole cloth, but you're trying to make a full dimensional character. And a lot of that comes out of the stories in scenes. So I try to write scenes because I've learned that from making films. That's how these stories develop. I often told my students that where I start the story, start writing, is not always where the finished story starts.
Sure.
Maybe half the time it starts at another place. When I get through the first draft, I say, oh, well, maybe a better place to start this would be someplace
Right.
else. But you start writing and you see what happens. And then when you go back and revise it, it's like, well, maybe I need to start this, launch the story at a different place, either earlier or later or
Do you outline?
no, rarely outline.
You just go,
Yeah, yeah.
and you have great success with that, obviously.
Short stories are easy. I'm working on a novel now, and I am outlining a little more, but I I was a bad chess player in the sense that I could see 2 or 3 moves ahead, but I couldn't see 5 moves ahead. I could see, and so it's futile for me to try to plot a novel out that way. I just can't
Do
do it.
you write purge drafts or do you write slowly?
I write. I try to. I believe in shitty first drafts.
Shitty first drafts.
Yeah, and sometimes they come fast, but they come often more slowly because I'm thinking through the characters as I do it.
Do you know Anne Lamott's book on writing?
Yeah, yeah,
And that's the
she brings
title
it.
of a chapter is Shitty First
Yeah,
Drafts.
yes, yeah, definitely. I'm sure I took that from her. I'm sure.
I have taught forever, and I believe wholeheartedly that the craft of writing is that first draft is coming up to the end of a first draft, and then the art of writing is in all the subsequent drafts. That's where you create the real art.
Yeah,
Same for you, I assume.
yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay, so what for you then, as you're writing, you write really great dialogue. What for you makes great dialogue great? How do you get there?
That's a good question. I think you have to have an ear for dialogue,
Mm-hmm.
but
It has to be innate.
yeah, I think it's hard to teach because I've taught writing too. It's hard to teach good dialogue, but it's also you listen to other people speak, and I often I have a notebook and I jot down phrases or things that I hear, just in people speaking, and that I save up that I might be able to use. And I've done a lot of interviewing of people, and you pick up the rhythms of the way people speak.
That's important, isn't it? The
Yeah,
rhythms of the way a character speaks.
yeah, definitely. And so that's part of it, but I can't explain exactly how I do it, frankly.
Do you write every day?
Now that I've retired, I from teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm finishing up another film right now. We just recorded the narration Friday with Martin Sheen.
Wow, look at you. So you clearly are capable of handling multiple projects at one time, including teaching and other things in your life.
Yeah.
What do you do to keep the trains running?
I'm disciplined.
What does that mean? Does that mean you have a set time for doing things, or what do you mean by disciplined? You don't slough off, you just go do it.
I don't like to leave things unfinished.
Mm-hmm.
So I make lists and priorities, and I get up early. My best times are in the morning, and I try to accomplish a certain amount each day. How do I do it? I think part of it is I'm interested in everything that I do. You asked early on in our conversation, what's the hardest thing to do? And I said stuff in which I'm not emotionally involved. I don't feel that I have any, that doesn't really resonate for me. But now everything that I'm doing, I like. That enables me, I think, to be able to be productive. If I didn't like what I was doing, I don't think I would be able to continue to do it.
It keeps it fresh for you.
Yeah.
I think that's really critical. If it's not fresh, it'll come out as being stale in the end product, I think.
Yeah, I'm writing a novel now, ambitious in a lot of ways. I don't know if I can pull it off.
Well, are you still fascinated by it, or are you starting to lose steam?
No, I'm definitely fascinated trying to think if I could pull all these strands together. It's like juggling. You throw all these balls in the air. Can you catch them?
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know yet.
Well, a lot of the work that you've done over time, not just writing to a certain extent, but certainly making movies, they all come with a little bit of different sorts of pressure. that you have time constraints, you've got financial constraints, etc. There's pressures on you as a creator. How do you handle pressure in your life? What do you do?
I play tennis. That's one thing. I take long walks. Film business, I am still making films, but I am not raising money. That's not what
You're
I'm,
letting others do the raising for you.
yeah, I'm not spending the rest of my time raising money. I find that very difficult.
So then how do you get the money? What do you do?
I have a good producer, or I get other people to. I'm attached to projects, and if they get the money, we can go ahead. If not, I'll go to a meeting, but I'm not going. Several years ago, I was trying to get a project done, and we were having a fundraiser in San Francisco. And I said to my wife, "You want to come to this fundraiser?" And she said, "I've spent years watching you go hat in hand. It's not interesting anymore."
No. No, I think that's the worst part about being in the film business, is trying to raise the capital.
It is.
And there are people that are good
Yeah.
at it and they're fascinated by it, but most people that are in the art end of it are not that interested in it. It's not that interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's not my strength or my interest.
But you're now at a point in your life and career where they're more or less coming to you or trusting that you're going to do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah. The other thing that I do, I am involved in executive producing projects that some of my students,
Mm.
my talented students, are developing. They're out there, they're hustling to get it done. And I work as a kind of consultant on their films and executive producer. It's like I show up, I act as this kind of guarantor. It's like, okay, they'll come through.
So one of the issues with documentaries in general, other than a very few number of documentarians, is they rarely make any money.
It's true.
How does one become a documentarian and stick to it when the chances of you becoming, let's say, rich in the Hollywood sense is probably not going to happen unless you're one or two famous documentarians?
You have to be passionate about what you're doing,
Mm-hmm.
but you also have to have a way of paying the rent, paying the mortgage. For me, I taught. That was one way of stabilizing my income, because developing these projects, even to sell, takes, the filmmaker bears the development cost. Because if you go to Netflix, if you go to HBO, which I've been fortunate to do, you have to already have a project that is viable, which means you have to have access, you have to find the characters, you have to have the arc of the story to convince people to give you money. And so all that takes time. So teaching was one way of stabilizing my income.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote other things. I've always been versatility. But many of the documentary filmmakers that I know, young filmmakers, they also edit or they shoot. So they have a way of paying their rent while they develop their own projects.
Mm-hmm. So obviously you've won 3 Oscars, which is amazing. I mean, to win one is amazing, but you've won 3. And I'm wondering, even though you won those 3, I'm assuming that didn't catapult you into another level, or does it do that for you as a documentarian?
The Oscar helped me to keep working. My first Oscar, I was young. I thought, oh, this is easy. I was also, it was part of the 60s, and I had a kind of chip on my shoulder. And I wrote a piece I was writing at the time. I was doing movie reviews for the National Catholic Reporter. And I was not there at the Oscar ceremony because Martin Luther King was assassinated and the ceremony was postponed for a couple of days. And I had plane reservations to go to South America, making a film about the Peace Corps. And it was really, really difficult to change. And the articles in newspapers said we weren't going to win, so it didn't seem worth staying around and changing all the plans. So I did not learn that I'd won the Oscar until I was in Colombia. And I wrote a piece looking at the Oscars from the point of view of an impoverished village in the Colombian Andes.
Wow.
And they entitled the piece, "Where the Timid Honor the Shallow." So it's like, All right, so that was not probably a very good career move. And then I discovered I was fortunate to have won the Oscar, and it was it was that they didn't grow on trees. So, when I won the second Oscar, I knew how to use it better. It enabled me to keep working.
And the third one was Kindertransport, yes?
Yeah, and that was so. It was 30 years between the first Oscar and the second, and 3 years between the Oscar and the third.
I certainly remember that was a huge sensation when it won the Oscar.
Yeah,
I remember that vividly from that night, and then subsequent to it, it was a huge sensation within the industry itself.
I've been privileged to work on really good projects, but my wife had bought a great dress for the first Oscar ceremony. 30 years and 2 kids later, that dress was not only out of style, but it didn't fit anymore. And to this day, she resents the fact that we didn't go to the first Oscar ceremonies.
That's fashion for you.
Right. But I promised her, I said, well, we'll get back. And it took about 30 years.
I've been having an absolutely wonderful, fascinating conversation with Mark Harris about writing and making documentaries in the movie industry and teaching, which I find tremendously fascinating. We're almost an hour into the show. We're going to wind things down now. I'm just wondering, in all of your experiences, and you've had many, are you able to share with us a story that's either weird, quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny? More than you've already told us, because you've told us a few.
I have one story about how I got into teaching. I never expected to become a teacher. But when I got to Los Angeles, a job that was promised me fell through. And we had just moved here. I just wrote a check to the movie company, and I said to my wife, we better like it here because it's going to be years before we can afford to move again. Anyway, a week later, I got a call from a friend. They were looking for a teacher at California Institute of the Arts.
Mm-hmm.
Someone was going on leave of absence. Classes were going to start in 2 weeks. Could I come up, show? I went there, showed my films. They were desperate to find somebody. I was desperate for a job. They hired me. This was Cal Arts in the 70s. I said, what do you do as a teacher? They said, oh, you supervise films. Maybe you can teach a course of documentary, but you supervise films. So they gave me a list of my students. They gave me an office. I sat in the office. The first student came in. He lit a joint and passed it to me. And I'm looking at my sheet. It's like, what do you do? Are you supposed to smoke with them? Are you supposed to buy for them? That was the 70s at Cal Arts. Wow. My introduction to teaching. I thought, oh, this is not exactly what I expected it to
be. It was more familiarly in those days, I think, if I'm remembering right, known as the University of Disney, correct?
It was, yes. It was, and Disney was started, and it was somewhat appalled by what they had wrought.
But they put on that campus one of the most innovative theaters ever created, which was the modular theater.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of wonderful stuff was going on there.
Indeed.
But that was my introduction to teaching. So, there are many stories I could tell, but that one is like...
if you're going to start off as a teacher, I guess if somebody's going to pass you a joint, that's telling you everything you need to know.
Welcome.
Welcome. Right. All right. So last question for you today, Mark. You've shared with us a huge amount of advice along the way, but I'm wondering if you have a single solid piece of advice or a tip that you like to give those, perhaps your students or those starting out in the business, or maybe they're in a little bit trying to get to that next level.
I think you have to have persistence. Persistence is really important. There are 3 things to succeed in the film business, I think. You have to have talent. You have to have some luck. But if you have talent, you have to persist. You have to believe in yourself. I think for me, you have to be willing to listen to feedback. The students who are most successful that I've taught learn to process feedback and to take from it what's valuable and to discard what isn't. Because you're going to get during your career so many notes, so much advice from so many different people. And some you just have to close your ears to. But other advice, you have to listen. You have to be willing to adapt and to listen. And the idea that as a filmmaker, as a writer, or anything, you're perfect is an illusion.
I think that that's absolutely accurate. And I think your first two pieces there are spot on. And for sure, I've told many people, many students over time, whatever you do with the notes you're going to get, because you're going to get notes, take the notes, take them all. Some will help you, some won't. Take what works and throw the rest away.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and that's tough to learn.
It is tough to learn because everybody thinks it's their precious baby that's being attacked.
And you don't know who to listen to. And what people tell you, and if 5 people tell you, or even 2 or 3, that something's not working, it's probably not working. If 3 people tell you you're drunk, you're probably drunk.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But their solutions, and I tell my students, listen to what I say is problematic, is not working, but don't listen to my solutions, because that's my taking your material and saying what I would do with it. That may not be your vision at all. You have to find your own solutions to what is not working.
I think that's just spectacular advice. Mark Jonathan Harris, this has been a wonderful, fascinating, fun, fast hour on StoryBeat, and I can't thank you enough for your time, your energy, and your wisdom today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure, my pleasure, talking to you.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.